China's economy falters, we're all trying to understand the underlying social challenges that Xi Jinping is facing. And Professor Lei really gets inside the Chinese system, doing her research with real people at the grassroots level. She spent many weeks and months on the factory floors in China, talking to workers and managers about how the rise of technology and tech production has affected their lives. Professor Lei trained in both law and sociology. She holds an LLM and a JSD from Yale Law School and a PhD in sociology from the University of Michigan. She is the author of The Contentious Public Sphere, Law, Media, and Authoritarian Rule in China. And her second book, The Gilded Cage, Techno-State Capitalism in China, has just been published. So we're very excited about that. We're also really delighted that our discussant today is Professor Susan Greenhalgh, who also does her work from looking at China from the ground up and at the grassroots level. Professor Greenhalgh is the John King and William Cannon Fairbank Research Professor of Chinese Society. So at the Fairbank Center, of course, we're always especially thrilled to have her here. Professor Greenhalgh has written and edited way too many books to list here, but among them, Can Science and Technology Save China? Fat Talk Nation, The Human Costs of America's War on Fat, Cultivating Global Citizens, Population in the Rise of China, and Just One Child, Science and Policy in Deng's China.
Hi, everybody. I'll be just a minute because we need to give all our time to Professor Lei. I have the great pleasure of introducing Yaowen in her new book on techno-capitalism, which she's going to speak about. In this book, Professor Lei traces the development, especially since the mid-2000s, of a so-called techno-developmental regime, characterized by the expansion of instrumental power over the people by means of new technologies and new legal norms. So she brings her skills as a sociologist and a legal specialist into this work. She traces what she calls the dark side of China's Gilded Age, spelling out the origins, the nature, and especially the contradictions inherent in China's current developmental model. In this important book, Professor Lei not only engages with classic thinkers in political sociology, Max Weber, Daniel Bell, Frankfurt School philosophers, and so forth, she develops a theory of China's contemporary, sci-tech-driven political economy that is sure to be a classic in Chinese studies and in the comparative literature on the developmental state. So in other words, she succeeds in doing what many of us aspire to, but few achieve, namely writing a book that contributes importantly to China's studies and comparative political sociology. One more point. What makes her work really distinctive is her grounding of the analysis in the central role of Keji, science and technology, in post-78 Chinese affairs. China's leaders have been talking Keji nonstop since the early days of the Deng government, but the place of knowledge and its real-world applications in China's larger political, economic, and societal development have not gotten the attention it deserves until now. With that, let me introduce Professor Lei. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for attending my talk, and thank you for. I want to express my gratitude to Dinda for the invitation, and also Professor Susan Greenhalgh for the very generous introduction. So today, I want to talk about China's techno development since the mid 2000s. So as a sociologist, I will focus more on the domestic dimension and also on the social consequences of this transformation. So let me begin with the story. So in 1998, President Clinton had a future forward-looking trips into China. So just 2 years before he convinced the US Congress to approve China's accession to the World Trade Organization. And his trip was very heavily criticized in the US because that was the very first time an American president visited China after the 1989 Tiananmen Democratic Movement. So he hosted a roundtable in Shanghai Library with the theme of shaping China for the 21st century. And then in his discussion, he said that I believe this will happen because of the technological revolution. And I think in your economic growth, you will almost leap over a whole generation of economic experiences that older European countries and perhaps the United States experienced, where you will essentially be creating an industrialized and a post-industrial society at the same time. So that was his prediction about China's future. And upon hearing the news that Clinton had mentioned the concept of post-industrial society in China, sociologist Daniel Bell, an emeritus professor in my department at that time, was super excited. And he reached out to the National Security Council immediately to ask who had written this call for President Clinton. And when he found that the president's comments were impromptu, he was very excited to see how influential these ideas has become. So since the 1960, Professor Daniel Bell had developed the idea of post-industrial society, concept of post-industrial society, they usually define post-industrial society with relation to the service sector. But in fact, in Daniel Bell's book, he emphasized the mutually generative relationship between science, technology, and economy. And he also emphasized that one of the crucial feature of post-industrial society is the enhancement of what we call instrumental power based on technology over people. And he also said that the design of post-industrial society is the game between persons in which intellectual technology based on information, data, computing, algorithm, and programming rise alongside machine technology. So these are the fancy terms we have been hearing again and again today, but he was writing about this in the 60s. And today, a lot of research shows such instrumental power. Scholars like Professor Zubov, professor at HBS, have written about the instrumental power possessed by big tech companies in the US. So basically, she argued that these companies profit from data, using data and technology to algorithm and to shape and manipulate, control individual behavior, as exemplified by targeted advertising. And this is the current phase of post-industrial society. And I also want to briefly mention about this book. So a lot of Cambridge writers here, Professor Ajamal and also Simon Johnson at MIT. So they recently published the book Power and Progress. So they talk about the varying relationship between technology and inequality. So they argue that although technology can bring about prosperity, but prosperity might concentrate only on specific elite groups, for example, political and also economic elites. And they show that workers can be replaced by automation technology, and also political actor like the government and economic business actor can use technology to increase the level of surveillance in work and everyday life. And they argue that in different kind of institutions and different narratives, ideas about technology and science, and collective action can impact who actually benefits from prosperity and technology. So basically, they argue that there could be different paths of technological development, and then different society and different countries make different options, and that could have consequences not only in economic development but also in social equality. So now I move to the Chinese case, and how I will talk about my study of how China actually chose a model, chose a path, and then made a transition. And the Chinese government at the local level, especially in coastal China, began to encounter the problem and the limitation of labor-intensive and export-oriented manufacturing in the mid-2000s. I began to do fieldwork in China on this topic around, I think, 2011. I was writing another dissertation, like GSD dissertation at that time, and I was very lucky that I was able to observe really rapid transformations in economy in China. And then I did a lot of intense fieldwork in China between 2015 and 2019. So let me just talk a little bit about the settings in which I conducted my fieldwork. So I studied the industry, the sectors that were considered by a lot of local governments as obsolete. So basically they were called like old birds, like the traditional manufacturing sectors. And then I also studied like factories that went through the automation process to make them look better, more cutting edge. And I was very lucky to know a lot of factory owners, and they allowed me to stay in the factory for weeks. And with that opportunities were really precious, because those opportunities allow me to observe the daily interaction between factory people, like the workers and managers, and also, very importantly, local government officials, because they enforce the law from time to time. And I also studied, so I studied these factories in around Guangdong area, in Guangdong, but I also interviewed a lot of similar like owners, business owner in Zhejiang province. And then some of this factory moved to inland China in this process, and some of them actually also went bankruptcy. And at the same time, you can I remember really the really great transformation, the rapid rise of digital economy in China. So I also studied the platform sectors, and I spent a lot of time with delivery workers in the food delivery sector. And I also in Chongqing. So I interviewed people in different places, but did my ethnography in Chongqing. And I also studied a lot of engineers and also management people in the high-tech companies. And usually these companies are in the tier 1 cities, but there are also companies in tier 2 cities. So these are the places where I did my research and interview. And after the pandemic began, I had to stop my field work. So I did a lot of online ethnography and also interview. So people were extremely generous with their time. And now I want to talk about the ideation dimension of this turn to technology development. So I talk about that the transition began in the mid-2000s, but there is a very long-standing aspiration to pursue national development through a focus on science and technology. As Professor Susan Greenhill's work showed that using science and technology to rejuvenate China has been the cultural DNA the Chinese nation since the perhaps late Qing period. So, and the fact that countries began to climb up the ladder of economic development by turning to technology development seems to suggest that there is only one path of this kind of development. But then debates between leaders, high leaders and scholars, technology and also show you actually there were even among the highest leaders, there were different visions on technology development. Here I can give you some example. So already Deng Xiaoping already had this kind of debates with other people in the beginning of the reform. And then his stance is that he wanted to have high technology. So every time when he talked about this issue, he tried to downplay the issue about inequality. And also in the 90s, there were huge debates about how China can further its development. It's related to like the geography. And a lot of scholars and also some leaders thought that it's considering the disparity, like regional disparity, it's really not good to focus to put all the resources in the coastal areas. But then Jiang Zemin at that time thought that China should actually have all of the advanced manufacturing and also like modern service in coastal area because that's the place with the best foundation. So in his visions, despite the disagreement within the party, he wanted to have talented people, and advanced manufacturing in Korea, but then moved more not that advanced manufacturing to inner China, and then in that way, then the migrant population they won't go to big cities. So that was his plan at that time. But there was a lot of criticism of this kind of idea. And I also want to, so that's kind of the dominant vision of visual discourse. And I also want to emphasize like the penetration of this kind of techno-developmentalism in society. So compared with people in other parts of the world, Chinese people tend to have like overwhelmingly optimistic and positive views about technology. And also national development, so we need to develop and then need to use the science and technology to develop China. And then there is also a strong ideology of meritocracies, and this kind of ideology usually can be used to justify a lot of institutions and policies that lead to inequality. So here I just want to show you some data based on world value surveys. That's in 2017 to 2020. That's the seventh wave of world survey data. And then there were previous waves of survey, but the result patterns are similar across waves. So in that survey, they include questions about people's attitude towards science technology, whether, for example, more emphasis on technology is a good thing, and science and technology makes life better, and just these questions are very similar. And the question, you can see that compared with people in other parts of the world, people in China have really like overwhelming positive and optimistic technology. And you can see, like, usually, among these kind of top 10 countries, usually these are countries that are classified as illiberal countries in the world. And so, one of them is Vietnam, and some of them are like former Soviet Union, part of the former Soviet Union country in Central or Western Asia. And I just want to show you like the four Asian tigers and Japan, because they share very similar like emphasis on development. And you can see like even Hong Kong, right? Hong Kong, Macau, and South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and then Taiwan is even here. So you can see they have actually, they don't really have that kind of overwhelming positive attitude about science and technology. So that just shows you kind of a strong belief in the idea that science and technology can be used as solutions to solve a lot of different kind of problems. And then this kind of, I think the important thing is that this kind of ideology provides some kind of default support of government policy, government's science and technology-driven policy. So that's the impact of belief and ideology. So now I want to talk a little bit about the social, economic, and political conditions of this, to explain the term to technology development. So despite the long-standing aspiration for technology development, China didn't begin transition until the mid-2000s. So the reason of this, the difficulties was so this difficulty occurred when a coastal province started facing scarcity of key resources like land, electricity, and water, and land was the most important issues. So in a lot of discussion about labor-intensive manufacturing, people tend to focus more on like labor, but then that kind of neglect the fact that labor-intensive manufacturing requires a significant amount of land. So usually government just gave these investors a huge piece of land for development. So that was, at that time, this was a really serious problem for coastal province like Jiangsu, Zhejiang, and also Shandong, and also Guangdong in the mid-2000s. And I also want to highlight that developmental studies scholars consider China as an extreme case of time-compressed development. So even when people compare China with its East Asian neighbors, so that implies that government and people in China have like less time for adjustment. So here I just want to give you some data. For example, like in 2010, when coastal governments endeavored to transition to a more science and technology-driven developmental model, China still had 242 million of migrant workers, and half of them migrated only to 4 provinces, Jiangsu, Zhejiang, Shandong, and Guangdong. And then 36% of them work in manufacturing. And many of the factories in which they worked were considered like high-end, obsolete by the government, but then the government at the same time began to pursue this kind of technological-driven developmental strategy. And as Professor Scott Rozelle illustrated in Invisible China, that's a great book. So despite the country's emergence as an economic and technological powerhouse, he showed that the labor force in China has the lowest level of education of any comparable nation. And I also want to mention briefly about President Hu Jintao's policy in the mid-2000s, because these policies are important context for understanding this transition. So at that time, President Hu Jintao emphasized a human-centered approach to development. And during the period when the Chinese government acknowledged the rising inequality and also social instability, so since the late 90s, a lot of collective action and also protests began and rose over time. And some of you might remember that between 2002 and 2012, the Chinese government itself was very surprised by the increasing level of inequality in China, and they stopped publishing a Gini coefficient, which is a measurement of income inequality in China, for 10 years. And President Hu Jintao endeavored to build some basic social safety nets and present, and also to maintain social stability. So we have experts here, Professor Winnie and also Xiao, and Professor Bill Xiao. They study the healthcare system in China. They know the government's effort to build this kind of infrastructure at that time. But at the same time, President Hu Jintao also has a concept of scientific development. So since the mid-2000s, a lot of government officials began to mobilize the idea of scientific development and to develop a lot of scientific methods, so basically a quantitative indicator to improve, the purpose was to improve governance and to steer economy, so the development of economy. So there was the scientization of statecraft. So they really want to make the management that apply the scientific management to governance. But at the same time, as I mentioned about the difficulty in the economy, so there was an effort among local government officials to mobilize the idea of the scientific concept of development to transform the birdcage economy. As some of you might know that, so usually the government officials, like after the economic reform, they were debates about the economic development, and they use the term, like Chen Yun used the term birdcage economy. So basically, bird and cage refer to the economy and also the government's control, and they think they should let a bird grow, but they shouldn't let a bird fly away. And then, but in the old day, there was no distinction between different kinds of birds. But since the mid-2000s, local government began to they want to actually choose like better birds, more cutting-edge birds. And then the strategy was to apply, again, use science technology to save China. And then they developed, so there was a scientization of the birdcage economy. A lot of local government officials and increasingly some central government officials developed a lot of technical instruments and to select deserving like birds and industry and business and technologies. And the purpose is so they don't really believe in the market, and they always talk about the coordination of the visible hand of the market and the invisible hand of the market and the state's visible hand. So they want to use this kind of technical instrument to make decisions and to help the development of economy. And at the same time, they develop not only technical instrument but also legal instrument because the results of classification and also metric outcome should have some kind of legal consequences in terms of the allocation of resources. So if you are considered like good birds or with higher value to contribution to technical development, then a lot of business actors or individuals, they are given some kind of rewards, right? Rewards can include like subsidies, contract with the government, access to land, bank credits, and more importantly, like a very lax regulatory environment. And then on the other hand, there was punishment as well. If you are not considered as falling into a good category, then the government can initiate some kind of legal actions, like they can enforce law in a very strict way, and they can also make law within a very short time. And then the purpose was they see this as some kind of scientific method to make the economy better. And then the 2008 financial crisis convinced them the necessity of doing this because that did show them the limitation of the previous economic development model. So you can see two contradictory trends. So on the one hand, the central government recognized the existence, the rising inequality, and they wanted to handle the problem. But on the other hand, there was a perceived imperativeness to further development China through technological development. And they think that kind of method requires some institution that actually might undermine inequality. And I think in the end, the second consideration in general trumped the first consideration. And all of this had occurred in an increasingly repressive political condition. That means that there were a lot of debates and different opinions in China among experts and even government officials, but then the shrinking political space made discussion and expression of different views more difficult. And here, I just want to show you some news article about the discussion in the mid-2000s. So that's before the 2008 financial crisis. So for example, here you see like Jiangsu, that's 2004 article. So Jiangsu began to talk about different kind of capital, foreign investment capital. They want to select capital in except for like allowing all of the capital to invest. And then Xi Jinping was the party secretary in Zhejiang at that time. So basically in his article, he mobilized the idea of scientific development. He said that Zhejiang shouldn't really have this kind of old birds. So old birds should go to the inner provinces, right? And then, so Zhejiang should only have this kind of cutting edge, like new birds. So that's the idea of this kind of thinking. And so I also want you to show you like how local government officials on the ground thought about these kind of questions. So these two quotes are from newspaper, like from officials in Guangdong. So the first is from like Zhang Bei, who was a district mayor in Shenzhen in 2008. So he said that we must eliminate as soon as possible, labor-intensive industrial transfer will ultimately help to expel the low-quality population. And Wang Yang, who was always considered as quite progressive, he said that when there is a large low-end population, the high-end population won't come. When the quality of the city increases, people who can contribute to R&D will eventually move and take roots here. So this kind of thinking was very prevalent among local government officials at that time. So you can see that these quotes reveal who was actually considered as human in the so-called human development, centered development. So, and then this is how like the Ministry of Technologies classify like high and new technologies, high and new tech companies. So you can see that they use a lot of different, they gave a lot of score, right? If you apply, then you have to be evaluated according to this standard. For example, intellectual property rights, ability to commercialize technology and R&D expenditure. So these are how they evaluate a company. So there are a lot of different kind of these things. These are just numerous examples across different localities. They are similar, more or less similar. And I just give you examples in Guangdong. And this is like Guangdong's, Shenzhen's point-based household registration scheme. So back in 2012. So clearly you can see, so they use this to allocate hukou, right? To decide who can get local hukou. So once quality is a function of their education skill and also the ability to invent pattern, right? You will have a lot of points if you can invent pattern, and you need to have some kind. It's good to have some honor, and it's good to be rich, right? You have higher personal income, and you have housing property. And I always say that I'm in this age, in this like 40 to 48 years old, minus 5 points, and not good. Only my hope is blood donation, right? But there is a limit. So these are some kind of example, and then. In the early days, local governments just asked experts to design classification, quantification scheme. But with the rise of digital technology and big data, and local governments began to invest a lot of money building digital platforms like what you see here. So data science and information technology have strengthened their confidence in the kind of instrument they use to facilitate this kind of transition. So this is like a platform, and a lot of cities in China have a similar platform. So that's also a way to make money if you run this kind of, you own this kind of company. So basically, they evaluate each corporation and to see like how much land, how much energy they consume, and their revenue. And then when these firms are classified, they have different categories, and then. Like a better, if your company fall in a better category, then your utility expenses will be lower, and you have a higher chance to get subsidy and a lot of like benefits. And one important, then let me just talk about like the new birds that emerge in this transformation process. So clearly there are new, like two new birds that rose in this process. So the first bird was actually not really relevant to technology. That was the real estate industry. So when I talk to people in Dongguan, in Shenzhen, I ask them about what are the new birds, and they say that's the real estate, the sectors. So here I just want to show you like this is like ratios of fixed asset investment in real estate and manufacturing to total fixed asset investment in Zhejiang province from 2004 to actually 20. So this black line is the ratio of fixed investment in real estate, and this gray indicates the investment in manufacturing. One might imagine that when you want to develop advanced manufacturing, you might need to invest a lot of money do a lot of investment, but you can see in the process of technology development, the investment in this kind of, and also Zhejiang is a place that really want to have more developed like advanced manufacturing, and it's a place in which the local government it's the first local government began to develop a program called Replacing Human with Robots. They are local governments they really don't want to have workers, they want to have robots. And then but then you see that actually, especially after the 2011, 2012, really the investment, the percentage of investment in real estate has actually surpassed the investment in manufacturing. So that's I call this the real estate industry a toxic but irresistible new birds. And then the real new birds is the tech, especially the internet sector. So in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the government, the central government selected the internet as a pillar industry, making its development a critical component of the government's effort to transform China's economy. So as you can see, the percentage of digital economy as GDP, digital economy's proportion to China's GDP actually rose from around 15% in 2004 to almost 40% in 2020. So that's the real new birds. And very importantly, as the internet sector became real like a new, very precious new bird in China. So they actually enjoyed a lot of privilege. So the first was they were allowed to access global capital. So in fact, there was a lot of restrictions about like foreign direct investment in the internet-related sector, but they were allowed to access a global capital in other way. And then they also enjoy a protected domestic market. And then these tech companies also had a great opportunity to partner with the Chinese state in a lot of domestic and international projects, for example, like social credit score, smart cities. And then, so usually I talk about the like scientization of statecraft, right? The government want to use scientific method to govern. And then when we talk about digital governance, but the other aspect of digital governance is digital economy. So basically, a lot of companies make money from their business with the Chinese government. And then they also were able to operate in a relatively lax regulatory environment. So the anti-monopoly law was enacted in 2008, but then there was really not a lot of enforcement until the recent years. So they were given a freer cage. And then in the end, these companies were able to develop some kind of boundary spanning, not only instrumental power, but also infrastructure power, because even though they are a private company, they actually are able to control a lot of like infrastructure, for example, like cloud, and also cloud infrastructure, and also online payment system. And let me just, we know that since 2005, the economy slowed down. And then, so that really the government began to double down on the effort to develop platform economy. And and I want to kind of talk a little bit about the nature and spatial distribution of these kind of jobs that grew out of the new economy. So basically, this kind of the tech sector generated a lot of jobs in labor-intensive services, and then I think they were able to keep these kind of low-end workers in second and third tier cities. They are doing a lot of things like delivery work. And then the job in skill-intensive service grew a little bit, but these jobs, they are not really a lot, and all of them are in tier 1 and tier 2 cities. And then one very important consequence is the fact that these kinds of tech companies, they exist like a digital kingdom. Like they have sovereign, like in their kingdom, they have the sovereign to make the kind of contracts, the kind of instrument they can use to set the rule for workers, users, and suppliers. And so basically, the government gave them space to make their own cage for gave company space to make the cage for worker, user, and supplier. And so let me kind of talk about the consequences of this kind of development. So the one is the disparity between appearance and reality. So the governments wanted to use this kind of instruments to increase efficiency and legibility. But in the end, I just found that basically people are playing the games. So not only official, but business actor and even ordinary workers. So a lot of people try to collude to produce the most desirable like scores and metric. And then and people actually, a lot of people kind of were skeptical about the data collected in this process, but those data were entered in the systems, and then media propaganda only kind of disseminate the success story. And a lot of government officials at local level and a lot of business actors thought that this kind of instruments wouldn't work, but their feedback were often overlooked because those feedback could not be translated into points in the evaluation system, and that really lead to a lot of waste of public resources. And then another tension emerged between the state and capital, and so the government wanted to use this instrument to control and also to create a predictable environment. But in the end, they create some kind of bifurcated regulatory environment. So when they think they want to give rewards to some sectors, some birds, they give them a lax regulatory environment. And then when they are dealing with like all birds, they enforce a very strict law against obsolete capital, and no one really can predict what's going to happen. And then the problem of giving a lax environment to the tech sector is that these kind of new birds in the end bursted the cage and then led to the undesirable outcome that the government condemned as excessive expansion of capital. And and there were, in my interview, I didn't have time to talk, but there were a lot of complaints about not having the rule of law. And another tension happened between the state and citizens. So it's even though the government wanted to have some kind of human-centered development and they're concerned about equality, but then the system they enacted in a lot of big cities led to the discrimination against the working class and their children because they don't really have enough points to go to school. And then at the same time, the government built, they gave preferential treatment for talent and their children. For example, this is a school bill by local governments for talents, for example. So people in Huawei, that's for their kids and other employees in big companies. And in my interview, I saw, in my field work, I just encountered some social protests to demand equal citizen rights to education. So these are just a quote of complaint about how like factory workers their kids don't really have opportunity to go to school. And then another tension exists between tech capital and labor. So as we know that, and they just show the distribution of prosperity between tech companies and also workers. And so a lot of workers in the factory, they thought they would have better futures in the platform sector, and they moved from the factory to the platform. And then in the platform, I just use like digital platform, like food delivery platform as an example of flexible employment because there are just so many of them. And they were controlled, the company used similar control mechanism like app algorithm and to manage these workers. And I compare this kind of control mechanism in the US, in France, and also in China. And then it's not surprising that these platform companies in China came up with the most meticulous, calculated, and most intensive technological and legal control of workers. And I also studied the protest organized by these workers. So because I saw Dinda indicate I have limited time, so I just try to skip things. And then you can also see that the tension between like engineers, that these are the elites and tech capital. So like Daniel Bell predicted the rise of technical class, and some sociology predict the rise of coding elites in the post-industrial society, but then a lot of my interviewees told me that they see themselves as some kind of human flash batteries because of the long work hours, and then the exploitation. One of the reasons that it's very difficult for engineers to resist this kind of very strict work condition was because of their difficulty in their the sphere of reproduction. That means that their housing, they have to pay the mortgage loan and those kind of things, and the concern of like school district and also household registration, and just make them feel that they have no options. So I study engineers coming from different kinds of family, and I found that engineers coming from the peasant and working families, and if they couldn't really work in a top company, usually this group are the most disillusioned group. They have the most disillusioned view about China's future. And then so consequences. I think to a large extent, the Chinese government still can divert some blame because of the gilded facade of the techno development. We cannot really neglect the fact that China developed actually still very well, and then people recognize a lot of especially working class, still
they still acknowledge the Chinese government's effort to make China as one of the two of the most powerful countries in the world. And then I also saw a lot of, despite this problem, I also saw a lot of working class people internalize this kind of division. They saw themselves as low end, and they think they are not deserving. At least for those people who don't really have kids, when they think about themselves instead of their kids. And also a very famous sociology, Michael Brewervoy, talking about like playing the game can manufacture consent. So everyone is playing the game, gaming the system to get better score, better outcomes. Then that process, if you kind of are engaged with that process, then that process manufacture consent. But then a lot of data also show that there is a fading facade, and then more and more people found it's meaningless to play the game, right? A lot of lying flat youth. And so I think I would tend to think that, so I know many of you might have read the book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. So I think for the rich people, for the like upper middle class, they can have the options of exits. And in fact, in my interview, I think in the end of my interview with a lot of engineers, I think, it's not that I was asking them questions. The situation became they were asking me questions about immigration. And then there were also a lot of, I would also expect like the scattered local resistance, the voice would remain, but those are like scattered and localized. And then I think the majority of people they just neglect this kind of thing. And so, and I just want to conclude, wrap up the talk. So I think the case of China's techno transformation is a case in which instrumental rationality expanded a lot, but then what Habermas called communicative rationality has declined over time. And I know you all heard about like Max Weber's idea of iron cage, and you like see the expansion of this kind of cage. And Hu Jintao talked about the scientific and also the human-centered development. But in the end, I think the instrumental aspect of the development overshadow the human aspects of development. And Professor Amartya Sen argued that the viability of development and human flourishing depends on the process of public reasoning. And we might remember that once upon a time, there was more space for expressing different opinions and different views. And as I illustrated in my first book, and however, we now see an expanding cage that, in my opinion, hinders the pursuit of more effective and equitable technological development. I will just stop here. Thank you. And I didn't have time to cover a lot of parts of my book, so you can ask me any question about the book.
Well, I am going to, you could sit down if you'd like. I'm going to take advantage of having ready access to the microphone to ask the first question, and then I'll welcome questions from anybody in the audience. So thank you so much for this incredible talk. I can't believe she talked through the whole book. You get an idea of the ambition of this project. I'm going to start with a kind of tough question. The basic question is, how do you conceptualize science and technology? In China, there's a widespread assumption that science is objective, it's neutral. Science and technology are these domains that are outside politics. And that assumption, which is not true, allows the state to do anything it wants with science and technology. It can claim that it has control over science and technology, that its understanding of those domains is correct. But science in China can mean any number of things. If Hu Jintao can talk about the scientific concept of development and what it means as human-centered development, that's an idiosyncratic notion of science. So in your work, Professor Lei, there's a lot on technology. It's sort of the tech-driven development, just what we would think, digital tech, data science, and so forth. And the science piece of your story seems to focus on the adoption of more rational measures of worker productivity and efficiency, right? It's sort of the digital governance and metric-obsessed nature of controlling labor. In that book, Can Science and Technology Save China? And the answer was no. But in that book, we use the concept of scientific governing through science, and we meant something a little bit different. Of course, these contributors were anthropologists, so we're talking more on a level of individuals and their interaction with tech and scientific experts. We're talking about the use of scientific rationality, scientific data to guide state governance of the people in any number of sectors, whether mental health, physical health, residential choices, and so forth. But what we concluded is that this notion of science especially really needs to be unpacked. It's really complicated in the Chinese case. So I wonder if there's any of that you can speak to.
Yeah, thank you so much, Susan, for the great question. And I have to say that Susan is one of my role models, and I read her work, and her work has inspired me so much. And in my work, I don't really kind of developed like a conception about science, but instead I look at how government officials think about science. So, and also how they, I mean, on the government side, I like look at what they consider as scientific methods. And then I think this is, I think there is it's very interesting because so this began actually when Zhao Ziyang was the leader, and there was an admiration of quantification. So I kind of study their admiration and mobilization of quantitative method. And in a lot of discussion, they even include a lot of utility functions. And they also debated like what kind of measurements and what kind of could be the best to measure government's performance. So this is kind of like a pursue, how they consider as pursuit of scientific method, but I don't really kind of make a judgment about whether that is scientific or not. But as long as they consider that science, I just kind of document that. And then, and I think it's related to this kind of formality. So this kind of science as a form of a government, right? They pay attention to the form so much to the extent that they don't really care too much about the substance. And that's really interesting. And so for those of you who are familiar with Chinese content, they talk about the formalism, 形式主义, right? And then, so it's interesting that in the process of like deepening scientific development, the system became like like they don't really lose the flexibility, and people just focus on kind of meeting with this kind of rules and then the metric system, but they didn't really have, I found, like from my interaction with government official, I think they also question whether that's scientific, but they have no ways but to kind of perform and to follow that kind of forms. So I think this kind of like scientific, perception, their perception really, I think it's really important because it restricts the form of governance.
That is so interesting. We must have a conversation. Okay, so happy to take questions from anybody. Oh, over here.
Okay, Liu Xing is Harvard Intermediate Fellow from East China University. Thank you, Yawen, for your fascinating talk and solid discussion. We know China is special in terms of technology, science development, and the use of sometimes especially effective, sometimes especially bad. But is that case also a common phenomenon or global phenomenon in terms of in the age of information technology and knowledge economy, that increasing gap between those who well educated and those who are not, even in America.
Yeah.
So you read book like Meritocracy Trap by Yale Law School Professor Markovich, right? And also the Tyranny of Merit by Michael Sandel. It's also in one degree, it's also the case in America.
Yeah.
And I like Fukuyama once talked in 1970s, if you are good at math, you're just good at math. But now your good at math lead to bring you up extreme advantage of high income and social status. You can go Wall Street, invest bank, or to the IT industry. So what's the difference and the similarity between China and
thank you so much, Professor Liu, for the great question. So here I prepare a table for you. I also kind of document the different trajectory of techno development.
So I think you are like 100% right that I think a lot of people overlook the similarity between the Chinese case and the US case. So I think these are the two worst example in terms of inequality. And so in the US case, and I mean, China learned from the US, learned from the Silicon Valley people, right? And then this kind of ideology, I think, in the US is the most common among the Silicon Valley people. So they are really similar. So in the US case, I show that it's Californian ideology. So the mixing of counterculture with faith in like emancipatory potential of new technology. So they are very similar, and the welfare state is also terrible in this country, and they both have very high level of inequality. And then also until this moment, the labor, I mean, there was a resurgence of labor activists, labor movement here in the US at this moment, but in general, it was very bad, right, for many decades. So I think the two cases are similar in a way, but then the Chinese case is different in a way that, like in the US, I think the lack of, the inadequate level of regulation is is partly because of the fragmented political and legal systems here, and then tech companies lobby very hard. So, but then I think in the Chinese case, the Chinese government intentionally created that kind of regulatory environment in the beginning for the big tech company. And also I think in the US case, the state, the government doesn't really have that kind of high level of instrumental power. I think that's the difference of the two cases. And I also want to show you the different trajectory of Taiwan and South Korea, because Taiwan and South Korea began to experience this process since the 1970s. For example, like TSMC was founded, the Taiwan semiconductor industry, that actually was founded but in the area when the democratic movement began. And the similar thing happened in South Korea. So in South Korea and in Taiwan, there was a simultaneous process of technology development. At the same time, the building of a rule of law system and the building of a more inclusive welfare state. And I think one unfortunate development in China was the fact that the political situation has been getting worse in this process that actually led to different trajectories. Yeah.
Wow, great. Thank you so much. Next, here's next. And then you're next. Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Lei, for your wonderful talk. And I'm an LM student. My name is Chen Zhiyo. And I have two questions. My first question is sort of technical about what you have talked about the birth case. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Then I would just ask my second question.
Yeah, great.
My second question is sort of related because I saw that the veteran journalist Wu Xijing in China posted a Weibo about Chinese technology actually yesterday, and both the comment section and reposting section were closed because obviously he touches upon some sensitive issues relating to this. So I think he basically pointed out to issues relating to Chinese technology development. The first is that he thinks that there's some overconfidence in China in relation to the technology development in China, which he thought is both misleading and detrimental. And then second, I think he talks about
Can you get to the question as
Yeah.
quickly as possible?
Yeah, he thinks that the Chinese officials have like short-termism problem and they're lying flat. So those create problems. So like my question is, what do you think of those comments? And do you think like it is because the Chinese government is playing as the most important player to sort of motivate or incentivize the development of the Chinese technology, and that's what's created the problem in China?
Yeah, thank you. So I think the overconfidence, I'm not, it's very difficult to say if they are overconfident, but I think in general they were very confident at the, until the recent moment. And I also think this overconfidence exists at a larger scale. I think I remember even among my own professors who teach in the US. And I think when the digital economy really expanded very fast and people talk about the four innovation, right? The share biking and also the online payment, online shopping, and the high-speed railroad. I think at that time, people were super optimistic about the future. And regarding the officials, now they have this strategy of lying flat. I think it's very difficult for them. Like some local officials told me they work like gig workers, because gig workers, they have the app, right? They have to look at the score or whatever, but now they also have an app, government official. Their performance, they were evaluating through this kind of digital governance, the app, so they have to look at how they are doing and doing that, doing this, but they just don't really have time to do like very important things, or they worry that they will make mistake, and they just follow the guidelines. And that's how this kind of structure, this kind of evaluation system, like structure their actions and how they interact with other people.
Thank you. We have a question up here.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Ning Luo. I'm a second year PhD student at the government department. And I want to follow up with Professor Liu's question, because I'm actually trying to do some empirical research on the relation between meritocracy and prejudice. So I wonder if you have observed any effects of this techno-developmentalism on Chinese people's perceptions of different social groups, or different, or maybe different countries or different nations, races.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think like Professor Yu Xie wrote a paper on this. So I think many years ago, he had a paper on developmentalism. So because some sociologists study like how people think about development. And according to his research, he thought that Chinese people think like development is imperative, and then they classify the countries into different categories. And I think, his research also showed that the emphasis on this kind of the existence of meritocracy. And in my interviews with government officials, I think my interaction with them just let me think they have some kind of social Darwinist tendency. They think a lot of people, what surprised me a lot, for example, was when I studied this policy of replacing workers with robots in some provinces. And I never really seen, I reviewed so many policy documents, I never seen any document that discuss about the future, the employment situation of migrant workers. That's not among their consideration at all. When I talk to a government official, they say those people are not deserving. If they actually work harder, if they go to better school, then they would have a better future, but they cannot stay here because they are not capable. I think some people just have this kind of tendency to evaluate people just based on their human capital.
Yeah, I have to say, I break right in here that the notion of suture introduced in the early 1980s just has exploded, and it leads to this absolute dehumanistic way of thinking about people. People are not human beings anymore. If they're low tech, they're just bad. Go back to the countryside and die. It's really amazing.
That's what government officials told me. They just go back to the countryside.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid that our time is over, and I'd like to thank Professor Lei for a fantastic talk and Q&A session.
Thank you, everyone.